Alright, welcome everyone to this video where I'm going to be going through 7 concepts you should know to get a job as a Django developer. I'm on the Just Django blog, which is on justdjango.com. You can go to the link in the description to check out the written version of this video. But in this video, I'm basically going to be going through this article, not word by word, just kind of skimming over it and pulling out the most important parts that I think are worth discussing, maybe in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to be talking specifically about Django, as the title suggests, but these concepts do apply to other positions and other frameworks as well. So it's not like this is only limited to Django, but obviously some of it might feel a little bit more specific to Django. So again, if you prefer the written version, then do check the link in the description so that you can go and read it for yourself. And before I get into it, if you want to see more content like this, then please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, because it really just helps YouTube know that this video is worth spreading to other people, and that helps me make more content like this for you. So I really do appreciate that. And yeah, let's get into the concepts. So there's a TLDR if you'd like to read that, but I'm going to go straight into the first concept, which I think is the most important, and that is database design. So there's a lot of concepts involved in that, but basically it's just understanding how data is structured. And again, in terms of Django, we're talking about Django models here. So understanding how you can design your models to reflect the database schema that you want. And this is really, at least in my opinion, where you will start when you're building any kind of feature, at least any feature that has to do with storing and fetching data. So you're always going to start here, and it's probably the most important part to get right, because everything depends on the way that this data is structured. So it's important that you understand how to design the relationships between models, what kind of data goes into each field, and really on a simple level, that's things like character fields and Boolean fields and integer fields, understanding why you would use which one over which. But really it comes down to the more intermediate things like foreign keys and many-to-many fields and other kinds of, or one-to-one fields. Those kinds of relationships between models are really important, because that's really where the schema starts to take shape. So this is the first thing that I would understand, or try to understand and master, because once you go into an existing Django project, there will most definitely be models already in the project, and you're going to need to understand those from the get-go. So you're not going to want to have to spend a lot of time understanding that. You should be able to just read the models and see, okay, this is linking to this, and this is how I do this lookup, and understanding those relationships really well will give you an edge going into an existing project. But also if you need to create a new set of features or a new just part of the project that relies on models, you're going to want to make sure that you understand this really well. Then once you have this done, then the next thing you're going to want to understand is authentication and authorization. And this is something that I also didn't spend enough time on when I got started with Django. And I think the more you spend time on authentication and authorization, the more the other features or other parts of web development and Django's framework will make sense. And this is just because everything normally ties back to authentication and authorization. In terms of how users interact with the system, that is. So every time a user makes a request, you need to determine whether they have permission to access what they want to actually access. And authentication can also be done in so many different ways. At least today, you can do session-based, you can do token-based, you can do JOTs, you can do all sorts of different things. And understanding at least those three, I would say, maybe JOT authentication last if you're not going to be working with APIs, but understanding session-based and token-based really well will give you a good understanding of Django's internals. And one way that you can really start learning authentication, at least the behind the scenes of authentication with Django, is by looking at some of the built-in authentication in Django and just playing around with the code and seeing what do all the views do, and how does a login view work? What is the form class that it's using? What does the form do? Where's the validation? Understanding all of those things will give you a basic understanding of how authentication works. And once you understand that, you can then start expanding that into third-party libraries like Django AllAuth, which is very popular, and a lot of projects use that. So if you're going through that source code and understanding how Django AllAuth was implemented, Then you can start to understand how social authentication works, which is a little bit more tricky, but you can start to understand general authentication. And this is, I would say, definitely one of the most important concepts you need to understand. And that's just because authentication is one of the biggest parts of web development. So I would definitely spend a lot of time understanding this. Then it's the flow of data, understanding what that is. And I've just called it that, but I'll explain a little bit what that means. Basically, at least in Django, you have your models, your views, templates, URLs, and understanding how data is fetched from the models or essentially from the database and passed into the view or fetched inside the view and passed as context into the template and rendered in an actual response. That whole flow of data is important to understand. So that's one flow, is basically fetching data from the database and rendering it or returning it in some way. But then you also have the flow from the other side, which is a user submitting data and actually saving that in the database. So going from the HTML form into the Python form, which validates all of that, which goes into the view, which then gets saved as a model or technically in the database, and returning that back up to the user. So understanding that flow of data and how you are retrieving it and showing it to the user is, I would say, probably one of the most important. There's a lot of important concepts, but this is really important because this is now trying to understand how to actually build the web application. Once you understand database and authentication, that's kind of more like theory and getting yourself ready. But flow of data is really where you're going to be creating your views. So using generic views or function views, whichever one you want to use. But that's where you're going to start to actually work and create all these different views. And the thing with views is that there's a lot of different concepts that come into that. So understanding models, templates, understanding the request and how the request is passed through the Django sort of system, if you want to call it that. So I've also just referenced a few of the form view methods, and this is a little bit more technical, but it's something that I think you should spend a lot of time on if you're going to be working with class-based views, which I would say you probably will. And so there's a couple methods there, like get context data, get form class, get form keyword args. So all of these methods here are, I would say, really important to understand. And this is, again, with respect to the form view, a lot of the generic views have their own methods that you need to understand. But understanding these methods will really help you get a grasp of the generic views source code. And that just lets you be a lot more efficient and understand what's going on behind the hood. So that'll give you a serious advantage. If you really understand how all of this works, or at least majority of the methods, then you don't need to be learning that on the fly. So this is a big one, flow of data, and it takes a long time to understand. It's not something that I think you can just grasp overnight because there's a lot of pieces of Django, a lot of imports and modules that you need to just work with over a long period of time to start remembering where everything is. So definitely spend a lot of time just building applications and building CRUD views. Then you'll see that this will naturally start to get a little bit better. Then something a little bit more generic, not really tied to Django in any way, is just understanding static and media file configuration. And so the most important thing to understand here is the difference between the setup in local development and production, and just understanding that locally you always have your static and media files in an actual folder on your desktop, and you're using those folders to store the files. So when you're running the server, it's just fetching them locally. And when you're in production, those files are not stored on the server. They can be, or there's different ways to set it up. But one of the more popular ways that you'll see that is you'll use something like the S3 protocol to basically push all of your static and media files to another server. And so that's where services like DigitalOcean Spaces or Amazon Web Services S3 will come in, and you can use those services to handle storing the files. Now, personally, I prefer DigitalOcean Spaces. It's a lot more user-friendly, a lot more understandable, and just easier to work with, to be honest, than AWS S3. But the point is that you need to understand the protocol itself, S3, you need to understand how these files are collected into the root folder and pushed out to the whichever server it is that is being stored on. Of course, you can also use something like white noise, and then it's handled more on the Django server itself, and that's also fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but just understanding all of these technicalities will give you a good understanding of web development or deployment architecture, essentially. So understanding all the bits and pieces of what makes a deployment in a Django web application. Then that kind of leads on to the next one, which is deployment. So I've just touched on the sort of architecture of it, and this deployment is a huge section, and there's a lot of ways that you can do it, but it used to be, at least before DigitalOcean released their app platform, I would normally deploy it on a DigitalOcean droplet, and I would manually set up gUnicorn and Nginx to basically handle those aspects of running the server. Now, since then, you've got the app platform, you've got another service like render.com, you've also got Heroku that's been around for a while, but these three as examples allow you to basically set up your application without having to do as much of the work as you used to. So you can basically just with a few clicks create an app, and it'll just automatically detect that it's a Python app. And a lot of those things like gUnicorn setup and Nginx, you won't have to do. Now, that's a lot easier today, so definitely going through that is a lot more beneficial. But what was good about setting up the projects in the past was that you really got an understanding of Linux and going into the server and actually setting up gUnicorn yourself and understanding really the behind the scenes. That's always good to some extent. So understanding how a Django server is run, it might not be with gUnicorn, could be with another service to just get the web server up, but understanding how to run it using the whiskey.py or the ASGI.py, that's very important. Understanding how the Django server starts in production. Understanding how the deployment is actually architected. So if you have your static files somewhere, you've got your database somewhere, you've got the server, the actual Django server running somewhere. Understanding all those bits and pieces and how they have permission to access each other is also really important. And you can learn most of this just by deploying on DigitalOcean. And this isn't an ad, it's just I prefer to deploy it on DigitalOcean because you can set up a managed database, you can set up DigitalOcean spaces, and you can set up a droplet or use the app platform now and have all aspects of the Django deployment covered. So understanding the architecture is, I would say, one of the most important sort of skill sets to have when you are trying to stand out, because deployment is tricky and there's a lot of services to actually understand. You've got AWS and GCP, or Azure, which I haven't even mentioned, but understanding this will really set you apart. Now, a note on this as well is that depending on the environment that you're going into or trying to go into, some teams already have their deployment configured. So it's not like you're actually going to change anything. It's already deployed. You're coming in to maybe do maintenance or do some sort of extra support, whatever the work is, for depending on the project. If it's a startup, it could be that now you actually do need to take into consideration how everything's deployed because it's a startup and nothing is up yet. So it might depend on the environment whether or not this is something you need to know. But in general, I would say you should try and master this, because once you do, it just helps you a lot in getting your own projects up as well. So that being said, I also haven't mentioned Docker, because Docker is used in a lot of the deployment or under the hood. So something like Caprover, which is a software that you can manage yourself on your own server, and it gives you this very Heroku-like experience of managing your own apps. That's something that you could look into. That uses Docker under the hood. Heroku uses a form of containers, so does DigitalOcean. So a lot of the deployment services use a sort of container-like system to push out new versions of the project, and just understanding the basics of Docker will help you in understanding that as well. So that's really the technical aspects of web development, at least with Django. But then there's two other sort of points that I want to make here. The one is research, and this is nothing to do with Django, but it's just being on the job. You're going to need to know how to research. You're going to need to know how to come up with solutions to problems you've never faced. And a lot of that is just really staying calm and not getting flustered by a new problem. You should just accept that you have the problem and try to research and try to find solutions to it. And so just getting good at researching is, in my opinion, it's a really important skill, because you need to remember where you're finding all the answers. We're all using Stack Overflow and Google and all these resources. So just remembering where you are finding these resources is going to be helpful. And just knowing who to follow, essentially, knowing where the resources are and what sort of resources you can use to solve certain problems is going to be good. So researching in general, knowing how to use Google efficiently, what to search, and learning how to read error messages as well is going to be really important, because the error message basically tells you what you need to search. So that's a big one, is understanding how to research. And then also just being comfortable being uncomfortable, which is basically just knowing that if you're in a job, you're going to be in situations where you've never had to deal with something like that before. It might not even be Django related at all. So you're going to need to just understand that you will be in those sort of situations. And I think just being calm and being able to take yourself out of the situation is probably one of the best things to just be comfortable doing, so that when you do get in those situations, that you don't freak out and you don't have this sort of blank moment where you can't solve any kind of problem. So the only way that you get better at this is really just by building more projects and coming across more types of problems and trying to solve them. So that's really the 7 things that I wanted to mention, or 7 concepts that I think are really beneficial to get a job. And I just have some other bonus skills here, which I think I'll go through very quickly. These skills, I would say, and also in having conversations with other people, are what I've picked up as the skills that will set you apart from other developers that are trying to enter the same position, assuming these are all sort of lower or beginner and intermediate sort of positions, not really specialized, but I'll get into that. So the first one is integrating with third-party APIs, and this is the first one because I think it's the most underrated skill. And the reason I think that is because you're seeing a lot of no-code solutions now. So you're seeing things like automated workflows and a lot of APIs that allow you to just fetch information and send it to different services all the time. And so if you know how to leverage third-party APIs and you really understand what it is to build a wrapper that can send requests and pass data and do things with that data, that's a big skill. And it's one of the skills that I think most of the people or candidates that are applying don't spend a lot of time trying to master. They'd rather try and build an API, which is good, but I think understanding what's out there and how to leverage that is a lot more valuable. Then integrating with front ends, which is basically just, do you know how to use React? Do you know Vue? Even just really vanilla JavaScript, but are you good at JavaScript? This is, I think, probably the next biggest upskill. If you have this, or you have a speciality in one of these technologies that allows you to build interactive front ends, or just a general understanding of JavaScript that allows you to jump into these different projects, this is a huge one, because it just lets you level up your own projects. And most, or I would say some or most projects these days that are trying to build nice UIs are going for something like React or Next.js or Gatsby. You're barely seeing just plain HTML sites now. So that's a very big one. And then after that is Docker, which is kind of on the same level as React in my opinion. But Docker it also just depends on the sort of project, whether they're using Docker, because you don't actually need to have Docker to deploy a Django project. So it's not like you need to have it set up. But most of the time, again, if you're using something like Heroku or DigitalOcean, they're using containers in the same sort of fashion as Docker. So understanding Docker, I think not only for Django, but just for general web development is going to be really helpful. And then there's also building your own APIs, which is basically using the Django REST framework. So if you understand the Django REST framework, which is, if not the biggest third-party application or third-party app that you can install in a Django project, if you understand the Django REST framework, that's, in my opinion, a really big one, because it's not that easy. It takes some time to understand APIs or using DRF for APIs. So if you understand that and you can leverage that with React, it's a serious skill boost. And I think on a CV, or at least showing that you can build your own projects using those technologies, is a huge way to separate yourself from the competition. Then the last one here is task queuing. And so task queuing is basically using something like Celery or any kind of asynchronous worker that can allow you to run things asynchronously. This one is probably the most difficult skill. Not to implement, it's pretty easy to implement if you just look through the tutorials, but just mastering it and understanding very specific errors and issues and scalability problems, that's where it gets tricky. And there are a lot of people that have made some great advanced just blog posts and tutorials explaining the problems that they've come across in implementing Celery, as an example, with Redis and in Django. But so I would say this is one of the areas that you could end up specializing in, because it's just so specific and or it's so difficult. And I think you could spend a lot of time just trying to understand this or understand the nuances behind how asynchronous tasks work. So, but just understanding it at a base level, I think, is good. If you know how to set this up and you know the gist of it, that there are tasks and you can run this task to handle some sort of workload that takes much longer than what a normal request would allow, then that's good. So just understanding that will definitely set you apart. So yeah, those are the bonus skills that I think are worth taking a look at if you want to set yourself apart from the competition. So yeah, if you enjoyed this, then leave a comment down below and let me know what skills you think should have been added to this. What do you think are the most essential things to understand before you try and get a job as a Django developer? And yeah, so thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.